It's already 5:30, right? Yes, so we can start. So today for our lecture series, we are pleased to have Professor Xiaoyu Lu. I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly.
That's
Uh,
perfect. Yeah.
yes, so um, his profile is extremely interesting. At least this really, I was really impressed by your research profile. Xiaoyu Lu is an assistant professor at School of International Studies at Peking University. Used to be a research fellow at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University. He studied at the University of St. Andrews for his MA in International Relations and Anthropology, and also received his MSc and doctoral degree in politics at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. His research areas and interest. He's focusing on international development, conflict and security, and political anthropology. His doctoral research it was on global norm contestation and translation, and he's the author of a monograph recently published by Palgrave Macmillan with the title Norms, Storytelling, and International Institutions in China, the Imperative to Narrate. So welcome, Xiaoyu, and the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for that very kind introduction. Well, I have to apologize first because I was just actually recovering from the freshers flu in the past week or so, because with the influx of students, and this is the one of the first semesters that we can finally have the class in person. And unavoidably, that the fresher flu is the byproduct of our in-person classes now. So I will keep my voice moderate. But if you cannot hear me clearly during the process, do let me know. You can leave me a message. You can raise your hand here on the Zoom so that I can see. I will say a few more words about myself and how that my main research is related to this presentation for today. And for me, that's usually I just don't have slides or PowerPoint. So if this creates any difficulties for the audience, do let me know. So I'm currently based at Peking University. And my research actually, yes, as I said, that I think for many people, it seems to be a little bit far-fetched. They are in two directions. Now, one is in more traditional kind of politics or IR research. So I research in international conflict, especially from an anthropological perspective, which means that I will do field-based research in conflict zones. Actually, last month, I actually returned from a field trip in Syria. So that is my kind of politics, security, and conflict, peace, and research. And in relation to that is more drawing on the theory, which we would say international relations theory, which of course that in essence is closely related to political philosophy. Although that's, like when people talk about theories, and especially when people talk about IR theory and theories in social sciences, there can be some differences there. But in the IR theory discussion, which is more related to my presentation today, I will talk more about, global norms, narratives, and global order and disorder. So part of the reason that why those two directions of research are all fall into my field of interest is also partially because of my research in conflict zones. That really inspired me to look into more closely at the IR theory, and especially on the very question of order and disorder. Because that's before you enter the conflict zones, that you would expect to see, chaos, violence, and, ordinary life completely turning upside down, which is a part of the truth. But also that when you walk into the conflict zones, you also pay attention to how people manage to live beyond that disorder, that ordinary or everyday disorder. So that empirical puzzle then later on turned into a more theoretical one, is that how people actually manage to live in this kind of constant state or even permanent state of disorder. Because right now we're looking to the civil wars or prolonged conflict. We're not talking about conflict for a few months or like in a couple of years. It can be 10 or 20 years. So if you think about it, it's almost a one generation's time stuck in a conflict. So that's the challenge is really about how those people live beyond that disorder. So that is in a way how my two research are in a way connected. And today, which I'm going to present in a way the theoretical reflection of my research, which is on the very question of order and disorder, which has been intensely discussed, I believe, in IR and also in politics and also in political philosophy. And the main presentation, of course, that I have already presented is in a couple of conferences, including the one with Professor Müller here, when we have the seminar on 天下, the very concept of 天下, that this is exactly the paper and the presentation which I gave there. And the second reason for me to look into this topic, in addition to its relation to my research in conflict zones, is also about this shared sentiment or shared emotions that we all feel nowadays. These feelings of uncertainty, these feelings of unsureness. I think it started even before COVID, but of course, throughout the pandemic, this kind of feelings of intensive uncertainty, I think all troubled us. And this has become, I think, not only a country's problem, this has become a globally shared emotion. So we often look into the discussion about that, how orders has become disintegrated in the past years or so, and how we may actually try to either to uphold to the old order, or try to establish something new. So in a way that this paper is also trying to address that collective feelings of uncertainty. And my kind of personal kind of opinion or argument is that we have to embrace that uncertainty first, rather than trying to overcome or neglect it as a way of getting out of it. So those are kind of like the two reasons why I'm going to present today this subject on the very question of order and disorder. And as a final note, before I finally get into my topic today, is that this is going to be ongoing dialogue, which I'm going to have, I think, with other intellectuals and also with other institutions. Actually, that I just confirmed like a talk with Professor Zizek, the Slovenian philosopher, a very controversial figure, of course, but a couple of years ago, he wrote specifically a book about the chaos, about disorder in heaven, because he had a quotation from Mao. The Mao once said, there's a great chaos in heaven and the situation is good. Well, in Chinese, it would be 天下大乱,形势大好. And then I think Zizek started from there and start his argument in terms of that how heaven itself has already entered the state of disorder. So this is also an invitation, which I'm going to send out later to the university. I also welcome everyone to join us again next month in the discussion with Zizek on the very question of global disorder. Okay. So now I finally entered my kind of presentation for today formally. And I want to start with a quotation from the Italian philosopher Gramsci. Gramsci, that in his prison notebook in 1920s, 1930s, once wrote that, the old is dying, the new could yet be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And this sentence always struck me. And when I started looking into the very question of disorder, this quotation was one of the first sentence that came to my mind. And I think that Gramsci's description of the interwar period in Europe about that social political condition still vividly applies to describe today's world. Because when he said old is dying, the new could yet be born, that was an accurate description about the painful transition between different political orders, and which was characterized exactly of this normative uncertainty. So this transitional period, which arguably that was what Gramsci was going through during the interwar period, and what we're currently going through nowadays, uncovers all the vacuums and contradictions in the existing orders and calls for alternative proposals to end this transition and to accelerate, in a way, this transition into a new set of rules or norms. And I think that behind this logic, saying that we have to end quickly, we have to quickly end this transition and quickly get out of this kind of feelings of uncertainty and all the risk behind it, I think that behind this kind of logic, more fundamental questions are neglected or being ignored. Now, the first of all is that how do we actually understand the transition, or using the original term, the interregnum, or this kind of in-betweenness of orders, and whether this is something that we can overcome or that we can pass through. And second is that is there a possibility of living together if we cannot find any common ground? Because now we talk about either new order or hold up to the old orders. We usually assume that there will be a minimalist overlapping values or norms that we can agree upon. But my question is exactly that if we cannot find any common ground, and especially now if we reflect on the Ukrainian conflict, I think, yes, arguably in Europe, you can probably have a consensus being agreed upon. But when you get out of that context, and especially even now within the public in China, for example, the opinion is still very much divided. And you can find that even that's on the things, on the very basic things, which that we would assume to find common ground very soon, it is getting more and more difficult nowadays. So the question is really about in this kind of radical dissensus. So if we don't have consensus, what we have is dissensus. And if we have this kind of radical dissensus that characterize our time, how do we still continue to live in this condition that is out of order, right? So it is not in terms of order or disorder, it is something that is even out of order. And to answer those questions, that's my presentation of my paper which I submitted as part of the Tianjia conference takes a different direction in the inquiry. And my argument, like the main kind of set of things which I want to say, basically 3 parts, can be in a way summarized in 3 parts. Now, the first part is about the Interregnum itself, about this kind of in-betweenness, about this kind of transition period. I believe that the Interregnum should not be seen as a state of exception that is to be overcome eventually, but a state of normality that captures the liminal, which is a term I'm going to explain later, and precarious conditions of modern life. In other words, interregnum, or this kind of in-betweenness, has already become the embedded feature of modernity itself. We are living in uncertainty, and this is part of what modernity has brought to us. So we always live in interregnum, in this process of transitioning, and becoming. So this is the first set of arguments, which I'm going to elaborate later on about the very concept of interregnum. Now, the second part is that when we're trying to respond to this uncertainty, to this transitional period, to this interregnum, as I pointed out previously, that people trying to come out with alternative proposals to replace the current international order or political order, to establish new orders, so to speak. So my second part is to, in a way, to challenge or to problematize the ways to imagine or to establish alternative orders. And I distinguish this kind of 2 different methods. Now, one is the maximalist approach to imagine this kind of world polity. So this kind of universal unity on which look like a normative umbrella for which it's in a way covered all of us, cover all the political regimes, cover all the political spaces on Earth. So that is the maximalist approach, which is represented by the very idea of 天下, proposed or popularized by the Chinese philosopher Zhao Tingyang in recent years. And in contrast to that, there's the minimalist methods, which I'm going to mainly elaborate on the basis of Michael Ward's idea of the minimalist morality. So the minimalist method is to specify shared principle, which can be agreed on the very kind of on the individual level, on the very base level, and then started to build on that minimalist agreement, gradually to build on something that we can all live together. So like my kind of metaphor for that is that it's like building the Lego. So you have small pieces getting together first as the basis, and gradually trying to be something much bigger on top of that. And my argument in the second part is that despite the seemingly differences of those two approaches, actually those two approaches share something in common, is that they're all consensus oriented and they're driven by the urge for order, by which that means that the order or political order is seen as a priori that is not only normatively desirable, but also practically achievable. And I think such urge for order, which I don't think you can only find among political philosophers in our daily life, this is something that in our daily life we can encounter on very frequent basis. You know, when our life becomes destabilized, almost the first thing that we're trying to do is that we're trying to do something to re-establish that order or sense of certainty of our individual life. This can be some kind of small, tiny things. It can also be something relatively big, for example, moving to a different country or to a different job, with the purpose of rebuilding one's life, of restoring the order that we once comfortably lived in, right? So this is not something that happened only on the global political level, but it's also constantly something happened on the very individual level on a daily basis. And I question those kind of urge for order for two reasons in the political sense. Now, the first is that there's always going to be a debate about the ownership of orders. The questions over whose orders or whose consensus can easily drive us into conflict or debates and destabilize the very foundations of orders. So in a way that one of the very controversial argument, which I did not put in the article, but I can in a way share here, is that I believe that a consensus-based order is never going to be an order itself, but rather it can be the origin of argument and differences that eventually drive us into even more radical conflict. So that is the first issue there, is about the ownership of orders. Whoever proposed the orders, there's always going to be a question about whose order that belongs to. Now, the second question about political orders, and especially the very concept of orders in global politics, is that it's very detached or being in a way far away from our everyday life. Because cross-border activities, for example, they happen every day on a basis, with or without the existence of so-called global orders. So people do not live in separation, or they do not live in isolation before they find common grounds, or neither do they stop living with each other in normative interregnums. By this, what I mean is that if we look at the periods before we even start to talk about global orders, when we start to talk about, like international institutions, global norms, back in, either in the medieval time or even in the early period of the colonial period, there was still, in a way, very intensive close border activities or transnational linkages, you may say. Now, without a normative discussion about what global order might look like, those kind of exchanges still happen anyway. So the question, of course, is that now that that those kind of communication or those kind of exchanges will still continue to happen, even that we do not have a clear idea about what a global order might look like. And here I want to draw especially the extreme examples in conflict zones is that if you look into conflict zones and when you imagine, that people are fighting for decades, over because of religious or ethnic or ideological reasons, and you would assume that they will never be able to live with each other ever again. But the funny thing, of course, is that especially this is in the case of Syria, even that people from different religions, from different factions have been fighting with each other for the past 10 years, and now probably 12 to 13 years, they still right now, when they go back to the old cities they live in, they still live in the same place. This of course does not mean that they forget or they forgive each other over their factional differences, but somehow they manage to still live with each other despite their differences. So I think the more pressing question, this is going back to my previous point, is that how do we live together in the absence of normative consensus, or what I would say that in the rooms of internationalism or cosmopolitanism. So this is the second part. It's mainly a critique about the urge of orders. And the third part, which is the part which I admit I did not elaborate enough, I think, that in the paper, and this is the part which I also want to discuss with more people for more elaborations, is that whether we can conceptualize ethics of disorder. Living in disagreement can open the space for ethics and practices of collaboration or collaborative living that do not require a pre-assumption or pre-establishment of an order, which means that we can manage to live with each other without a social contract from the very beginning. And this point out the realities and practices of dissensus in contrast to the idea of consensus that constantly blur and challenge the boundaries and lay down the mechanisms for digesting the differences. So here that I want to propose a dissensus-inspired method that advocate for this kind of ethics of disorder that deals with change, uncertainty, and otherness in our time. So this is the final argument. That's when we have the critique of the urge for order, which I want to propose is something that's what kind of like the things can, in a way, still make us to be able to live with each other despite all those differences. Apparently, it is not some normative agreement. So if there's no normative agreement, then what it is that still, in a way, hold us together for collaborative living. And ethics of disorder is something that I have in mind, but I can probably come out with a better term, I think, later to describe this kind of co-living, this kind of state of co-living together. Okay. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to leave a little bit more time for discussion. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to, in a way, elaborate a bit further about those kind of three parts, which I mentioned. So the first part is about how do we understand the very concept of interregnum. So interregnum, of course, as I previously quoted, it was a term that was, of course, existed before the interwar period. It was used to describe this kind of temporary vacant state of throne or the suspending of laws between two regimes. When one king's out or one queen's out and the other king has not come into the place yet. This is the interregnum. And when it was used and popularized by Gramsci during the interwar period, it was used to describe this kind of social-political condition in continental Europe during that time, or more specifically in Italy. And in recent years, in kind of recent decades or so, we have seen a revival of the use of the term interregnum. And I think this largely thanks to the sociologist Bauman, who in a way expanded the spatial usage of the term interregnum and used it to describe the global condition. And here his definition is that interregnum is that when the rulers no longer can rule and the ruled no longer wish to be ruled. So I think many of the morbid symptoms, so to speak, of our current times, such as the rise of populism, polarization in politics, and in a way the retreat of internationalism or cosmopolitanism, can be seen as the result of this kind of ongoing interregnum. When once the dominant ideology, you can call it neoliberal or something else, but we know once this dominant ideology after the Cold War no longer can hold on to this kind of global imaginations. And right now, there are not yet any alternative order being proposed or being strong enough or being convincing enough to replace it. So in a way, we're in this kind of in-between state, which is characterized by uncertainty and risks. And this sense of failure that we produce in this kind of period is exactly where the Chinese philosopher Zhao Tingyang started with his analysis of global disorder. When he talked about global disorder, of course, this is something that he is trying to critique. This is something he's trying to avoid. So his idea is that disorder is something that's with the absence of political meaning. And for him, that this kind of like in-betweenness that we're going through is not about the result of failed states, but a failed world that we live in. And later on, he wants to propose the very idea of the framework of 天下 to save that failed world rather than failed states. And I think my understanding of interregnum is, in a way, the first point of the divergence this paper takes in contrast to many of the discussion here. Now, if we
I don't know if you can hear me now, but we've lost you. At least we can't see you in the video. Can
hello?
you? Hi. Oh, yes.
Yeah,
We can. Yes. Now you're back.
yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yes.
it was for some reason it was cut off. Yeah. And I believe I just finished talking about Zhao Tingyang's 天下 and failed war. So that the kind of like the argument which we want to follow on that is that we all seem to have a temporary definition about the very concept of transitional interregnum, which that we all have the belief that this in-between state is something that eventually is going to go past in one way or the other, or you can go in different directions. It can turn into like the restoration of a functional order, or it can slide into anarchy. It can be good or bad, but the very idea is that we believe this state, this kind of transitional period, is temporary. So we seem to have a pre-assumption about the shortness of interregnum. But the question is exactly now that the interregnum periods seem to be lasting much longer than what we expect. And like even that we have a so-called like established order, this kind of interregnum period can come back every now and then to disrupt the so-called orders. So if we look at that, can interregnum still be called as a transitional period or transitional phrases? Now, if we look at the very concept of liminality, which is originally the concept that's being used in anthropology to describe this kind of the period in the rite of passage, when that individual that's in one state has been socialized into the other state. For example, that there are many rituals which would give a boy or a girl its status as an adult. But between those kind of rituals, there were periods which that this individual is neither this kind of a child anymore and has not yet become an adult yet. Right? This is the liminal period, which we would use to analyze in the discipline of anthropology, which is quite like the very concept of interregnum, but in the political sense. And in anthropology, one of the inspiration which I draw from there is that when people are talking about liminality, which people used to believe that this is a state that's also, temporary. It's some kind of a period which is going to pass eventually. Is that people realize this kind of temporary state is becoming more and more kind of permanent. There is this kind of space which that there's no yet establishment of orders, and there's constantly shift of multiple layerings of norms and rules. And if we look at that example, is that nowadays is that if we look at the past, maybe that we can clearly define that when a person's social role, so to speak, is being defined, and when we say that at a certain age that he or she should get married and get into the next phase, so to speak, of the life. But now that there seems to be that kind of certain set of stages to divide an individual's life into different stages become less and less relevant or convincing for us. And that is in a way the very concept of how the very concept of liminality has been discussed in anthropology. Is this kind of feelings, these liminal feelings, so to speak, which we used to be believed to be temporary, but in modern lives, it seems to be it's getting more and more permanent. It seems to be a long-lasting state. And many scholars would argue saying that the sense of disorientation and the uncertainty is deeply embedded in the formation, the operation of modernity itself, which means the modern life itself is about identifying and responding to crises and uncertainties, either in individual or in collective forms. So the society is not moving from one order to the other, passing through the period of interregnum, but is punctuated in a permanent state of transitioning and becoming, without evolving into a final and stable format. So in a way that this also means that either for our individual life or for our society development, there's no final end. There's no final ending which you can move towards to it. But rather, your life itself or the politics itself nowadays is about responding to the constant uncertainties and being always stuck in this kind of permanent state of liminality or uncertainty. So this is my understanding of interregnum. In short, is that interregnum is not a temporary condition. It is not a transitional period like the previous thinkers would believe to be, but rather nowadays it has becoming more permanent. It has become a condition of our life that we need to face every day and also to face in long term. Now, under the condition of interregnum, whether you believe it's going to be a long term or it's going to be a short term, there are kind of proposals for transitions and for alternative orders, in a way trying to get people out of it. So this is the second part, which I'm talking about, is that the responses to the failed world, so to speak, or the failed orders, is about how to get out of it and how to accelerate the transition to the new orders. And here, that's the proposals which I'm going to elaborate are mainly the proposals put out by the philosopher Michael Walls and also the Chinese philosopher Zhao Tingyang, which I believe represent minimalist and maximalist approaches to the question of interregnum and the very question of order itself in two different ways. Now, when Michael Walls lays out what he called the thick and the thin moralities, he believed that the difference is that the minimalist morality is a set of universal principles that we would agree upon, and the maximalist morality contains a larger range of meanings in historical, cultural, and political context. I think one of the best metaphor or the best description that he came out in terms of the thin morality, which is a concept he's trying to advocate, is that this is kind of morality that is closer to the bone. The closer to the bone, that means it's something that even without your cultural historical identities, this is something that is still you have within you, right? But my kind of analysis of minimalist and maximalist moralities is in a way different from Walls' categories. I think that the starting point of ontology is what differentiate different layers of norms or orders. So Michael Ward's idea, which he advocates, is a minimalist morality, follow this bottom-up approach, which I use the metaphor of a Lego building, which the ontological priori is assumed at the minimalist level, and asking that what is the basic set of principles or norms that can be agreed by individuals or even among the divided self and identities. So you can even divide one individual into different identities and different self to say that what can be agreed upon at the very minimalist individual level. And Zhao Tian's idea in Tianxia, for example, that's assume a different approach that is more from a top-down approach that takes the whole world as the ontological priori to identify what we can agree at the global level first, at the planetary level, before moving down to state and to the individual level. So for me, what distinguishes between the minimalist or the maximalist approach about order is about where do they start in terms of ontology. Do they start the ontological existence from the very individual basis, or do they start from the very top, from the whole global, from the whole planet level? And in both of the works, they kind of try to distinguish their ideas from the procedural morality. So this is a concept which we can use a lot of time to explain, but in short is that when Michael was saying that my idea of minimalist morality is different from the procedural minimalism, is that when people saying that when people from the very camp who advocate for the procedural minimalism, is that they would say that it is difficult to say what might be the minimalist morality we can agree upon, but we can agree upon on the minimalist procedural agreement, the set of norms or set of rules that we can use to decide what might be the best ideas or the orders. We can design the different kind of institutional designs, by voting, to ensure that with what kind of procedures that we can reach out to that minimalist moral agreement and for our society. So that is the procedural minimalism, which is different from what we're going to discuss here. So that is the distinction that Michael Ward spent a lot of time trying to put out there. And for Michael Ward, the minimalist morality is what binds people temporarily. So it's not really for a long time. It's only to deal with a certain issue or crisis. It is not a long-term mobilization tool. And the other thing is that it is something that is deeply seated in individuals, related to the very fundamental feelings and emotions that can resonate with all of us. And he believed that is the basis of the minimalist morality. So going back to the very concepts of the metaphor of Lego building, I believe what Michael was believing is that the reason why we can agree from the minimalist level among the individuals is that eventually we all have the same colors of the Lego that can put into together. And when that analyzed, it need to move out to the global order or to the global level, to the political level. Then the question would, of course, that what Michael Ward would think would be the minimalist morality for global politics. And he believed that it would be self-determination, the very principle of self-determination, which right now is the very basis for most of the international or the mainstream international laws. It's a group of people or the collective actors can decide, what kind of the political entity or what kind of political regime that they want to put themselves into. The very principle of self-determination. And Michael Ward believes that if you take that minimalist morality from the individual level to the global politics, then self-determination will become the very minimalist morality or the minimalist principle for global politics. But of course, the very question is that how would you say if that you have the principle of self-determination, very quickly what you face is these issues with separatist movement from all over the places, right? Because according to the principle of self-determination, many nations or peoples all have their own kind of decision in terms of what kind of country or state they want to be in. And Michael Watts believed that this is the slippery slope that we cannot avoid. And for the minimalist morality to operate, national separation should be supported whenever demanded by political movement and popular will. And that is very controversial, of course, if you look at the example of, again, if we took the example of Ukraine now, and we look at the 2014 case related to Crimea, Michael Watts' the framework would be that if the people in Crimea voted to be independent or part of the the Federation of Russia, then it should be allowed, right? According to this principle. So that's, but of course, the rest of Ukraine, and I believe probably the majority of the European Union won't believe that such action would be a justified one. So even you have this kind of minimalist principle, the question will always be that whether a separation demand is representing the popular will, or what kind of legitimate mechanism of representation we can use to ensure that this reflects the popular will. And this, in a way, throws us back into the institutional requirement, procedural-wise, about what kind of thing we can use to determine the collective will. So the minimalist approach, it will be struggling with this kind of endless division issue. Is that you can always come down to a more minimalist principle or more minimalist unity or entity for decide that what can be agreed upon. Now, to get out of that, to get out of this kind of separation, you may say tribalism, factional politics, polarization politics, Zhao Tingyang's idea is very different. Now, what he believes in is that there will be the ontological unity from above, which would he call 天下 or all under heaven, which that will have this kind of all-encompassing ontology that works like the umbrella for all of us. And we have the universal worldview. So he used the phrase like take the world as a word to assume this kind of ontological unity of the world as a priori before developing into or moving down to more specific moral rules and norms. And in contrast to Michael Watts, that for Zhao Tingyang, of course, the sovereignty of nation state or the very principle of self-determination are not the basis for a functional world order or the world system. Instead of resorting to self-determination, Zhao Tingyang's idea of 天下 is almost a manifesto for the abolishment of the system of nation state, because he believed that this kind of system of nation state will always be operated or driven by this logic of competition, and eventually getting us into this kind of hopeless idea of anarchy. And the very question or the very issue or the very critique I want to put out here with the very framework of 天下 is that how to persuade the minds of the people of the nations or the nation state, the current nation state, to accept that there's this kind of alternative worldview and this kind of thick moral imagination or ontological unity that apply to all of us. Now, Zhao Tingyang did not provide a strong argument for it. He did mention about the establishment of world government or international governance institutions. And he did have some kind of, I would say, rather kind of simplistic ideas about how to expand in the United Nations or international institutions like that. into more functional kind of international institutions that reflect the very idea of 天下. But the very question, of course, is that if we cannot have the agreement of the current nation state, this kind of 天下seem to be a good imagination, but it's not going to be a political reality. So the framework of 天下can appear as hollow without a change in popular will. And when the intervention of world institutions or governance institutions is seen as necessary in this kind of world unity, once again, we are kind of using universalization tools or institutions that will combine, coercion, persuasion, all those kind of political instruments that we use in old global orders. But leaving all those kind of practical issues aside, I believe that what has been the true kind of problematic core of the minimalist and maximalist approach is that they all kind of share this intention or this kind of urge for order that is to diagnose the current interregnum situation as problematic and trying to propose or trying to use a new set of orders or new set of different rules and trying to replace them. But again, that's the urge for order is the same, exactly like what has been the very basis of the existing and the failing old orders. So this comes to the very final part, which is the third part on ethics for disorder, or ethics of disorder. Which I would say that, once the interregnum is being taken as a permanent condition, the transition to a new order will no longer exist because we're currently in this kind of in-between state. There will be no new orders that coming down or coming up in two different senses to replace the current uncertainties, to save us, so to speak. So the real question is about finding the possibilities of coexistence in disagreement or in this kind of interregnum state, rather than about getting out of it. So that the question is that is order really the necessary condition for peaceful coexistence? And here that I repeat those two issues which I mentioned in the introduction is that the urge for order have two unsolved problems. One is about the ownership of orders. We can happily propose all kind of different alternative ideas, but the question about whose order and who benefit from those orders can always be the origin of controversies and conflict. The second problem is about the relevance of those orders. We can come up with different proposals, but the very question is that how that kind of different proposals for global orders is relevant to everyday's life. People can still, in a way, have transnational communications and connections with or without the orders, so to speak. Now, if we take disorder as the basic condition of life, how do we manage to sustain the continuity of human society in this kind of radical disagreement or the radical dissensus? So I believe that if we can conceptualize the very idea of the ethics of disorder a little bit further, it is really about to discover or to conceptualize not something new, but about the existing practices and actions that already create the possibilities of coexistence without consensus-based order. Citizens already started to talk with each other and communicated with each other before government signed international treaties in terms of to regulate their mobilities, right? So those kind of practices long exist before the theoretical assumptions of orders. So this is a form of everyday cosmopolitanism, which I would say. And they become the temporary suspension of moral pre-assumptions and follow the very logic of contingency that deals with the emerging uncertainties and ambiguities in our modern life. I can use a more concrete example here instead of theoretical one. Now, if we imagine that, for like a traveler, probably in the 17th century or in the 18th century, who want to travel around the world, or he or she that probably won't carry a passport and is not under the kind of protection of any kind of international treaties or conventions. So what kind of norms or what kind of ethics that would he or she being used to facilitate the very possibility of the transnational travelings or the transnational mobilities would be the very basis of the communication that he would or he or she would have with the locals from different countries. Is this definitely not something which we would call moral consensus, right? But it's about something that will allow him or she, her to respond in a contingent way, in a creative way, to the uncertainties and differences that the individual is going to encounter along the way. So I believe the very idea of dissensus will provide a very good reference to understand this. The consensual version of politics is about the reduction of people into political population and transform politics into the hands of professionals or the affairs of the national government, which is exactly on the very opposite direction of the very principle of egalitarianism. So the true meaning of politics, or the politics of dissensus, is the activity that overturns the practices of reduction and challenge the perceived norms in the social distribution or redistribution. So I believe that the true actions of border crossing, either in physical or metaphorical sense, requires the ethics of disorder. So it's about transgressing the existing boundaries and the rules and regulations. And I'm going to shortly mention about this kind of two mechanisms that we use every day to enable this kind of communication without moral consensus. Is that we have to constantly forget. This very practice of forgetting is that we always need to, in a way, leave behind some of the existing cultural, political, historical contexts or identities behind us, to enable us to enter like a strange or like a different context that we can communicate with some situations or individuals that we have not anticipated previously. So to enter a different country, for example, or to enter a different space, we need to forget about certain practices or habits that we used to have in the past. So we constantly use, or we have in the past used this kind of practices of forgetting as a way to facilitate communication without normative consensus. And the other mechanism which we constantly use in the past is the very idea of doubting. So doubting is the attitude that if we in a formal discussion of norms that is being excluded, if we want to agree upon something, the very idea is that we have to believe in that belief. We have to believe in that norms. So doubting is not something that is being encouraged. It is not seen as a positive quality in building normative consensus. But in the very practice of dissensus, doubting has become really important. It is intuitive. Because only by doubting we can reflect on the existing frames, on the existing norms that allows to break out of the box, so to speak, and enter the spaces of coexistence in normative dissensus or in normative uncertainty. So by forgetting and doubting, we create exceptions in ethics of disorder that is very distinct or different in comparison to the normative orders, which we would usually discuss. Now, going back to those two problems that the proposals or the urge for orders would have. Now, the question, the first of all, is about the ownership of orders. Now, if we have the ethics of disorder, then the ownership won't be an issue because nobody can own exceptions. If we constantly create contingent situations and state of exceptions, there will be no argument in terms of that who would own those kind of exceptions. And ethics of disorder dismantles the very concept of ownership because it constantly disrupts the existing institutions of distribution and redistribution. And the second question that the urge for order would encounter is about the relevance, that how that kind of discussion of order is relevant to the everyday life. And I think this is exactly where the ethics of disorder comes in. It is something that is not about guiding the abstract political principles. The ethics of disorder is exactly about breaking down the boundaries between the everyday and the big political level. And it's about how we can utilize the everyday practices that we used before and we're going to use, and use that to challenge the very basis of the assumptions that we have about the current global politics. So ethics of disorder is essentially everyday. It is essentially local. It is essentially something that we are going to practice and follow the very logic of practice rather than the logic of the normative orders would follow. But the question or the problem with ethics of disorder, of course, is that we cannot romantically imagine that living in disagreement is going to be a peaceful one. So I think the challenge, or what should be answered, is that, which is something that which I have not figured out yet, is about how coexistence can live into a more stable condition of peaceful living. So we can happily accept, we can happily acknowledge disagreement or dissensus, but how to make that acknowledgement of disagreement into like a guarantee for more peaceful coexistence, I think is going to be the challenge of the ethics of disorder. So the ethic of disorder is not necessarily a peaceful one, but I don't think that's like the urge for order will be a peaceful one either, because we have always seen that what violence has been done under the very banner of restoring orders. I think that to make ethics of disorder more effective is that we have to create a space. It's not about create a moral consensus, but about the creation of the spaces that allow the switching of moralities and individuals and groups, so that one individual can switch from one moral universe to the other and switching back. So I think that moral tolerance is about that human beings are open to persuasion and to some extent even to betrayal. Betrayal again is a negative quality which would in the usual discussion of political philosophy. But I think in an example of ethics of disorder, betrayal is a good quality in terms that it allows or it acknowledges that individuals can switch between different universes, moral universes. So that my conclusion would be that to realize that we can interact to kind of to establish these very possibilities of co-living together is to realize that we can interact with people radically different. So this is the true essence of ethics of disorder, the realization that we can and will be able to interact with people in completely moral disagreement or without any establishment of moral consensus. So going back to the, in a way, broader or more realistic example, which that in my coming trip to Europe for conferences in May, one of the arguments which I want to throw out there is that in the past that people would assume that emerging powers like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, or Russia would eventually come to share with the existing values and principles. But this expectation has failed the West in the past. And I personally do not think this should be a normal expectation from the very beginning anyway. But of course, the question is that nowadays is that if you realize the emerging powers, or it can be any countries or individuals, they just simply will not share the values or the morals with you. Is there still a possibility of peacefully co-living together? And my kind of final note on that is that radical oddness is exactly what makes conversations possible. Because the deep-rooted conflict did not arise from the notion that we're different, but from the question that why the other is not the same with me. So those are two different things. If we do not have the expectation for the other to be the same with me, many conflicts would not start from the very beginning anyway. So to acknowledge that otherness is to accept the necessity of living together without temporary consensus. So this is what I would say a form of everyday cosmopolitanism or ethics of disorder on the rooms of moral fragmentation or polarization that characterize our time nowadays. Right, thank you very much. And I believe that's happily ends exactly with the framework of 1 hour. And right now we can go back to the host, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have or any kind of point that you probably missed out in the past hour or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very fascinating topic and a very, very interesting way of analyzing and reflecting on these topics. Yes, so we open the ground for questions from both people that are here present in the venue and those that are joining on Zoom. Those on Zoom maybe can just raise the virtual hand. Victoria, maybe there is one other. This is working.
Yeah, this is just a quick question for clarification. You used the term anarchism or anarchy at several points in the talk, and I wondered how you were understanding the relation between disorder and anarchy.
Yeah. Is there any kind of like additional point you want to add on there in terms of that anarchy and disorder?
Yeah, okay, I'll add the additional point now. Yeah, it's just that in my way of thinking about anarchy, there are basically two types. As some anarchy is very highly ordered, it's just not ordered from the head, whereas other forms of anarchy are much more like what I think you would describe as disorder.
I personally do not have an issue with the term anarchy. And I think by a lot of some of my colleagues, they write my paper, and I think that this is actually in a way a different version of the anarchy thought, because the ethics of disorder which you propose is exactly like in a way or like a positive tone or like a positive version of anarchy. That's in a way that is different from what Hobbes would describe in terms of the global anarchy that is characterized by violence and chaos. So I think that one way of understanding my argument that's I would say that if James Scott's recent ideas of anarchy is probably exactly the same, which about what I'm going to argue here anyway. So that anarchy is not about, in a way, disorder, what Hobbes would describe as the disorder or the violence here. Anarchy is actually expose the possibilities of coordination, of co-living together without the intervention from a political power from above. Yeah. So I think that from that point, if the very idea of anarchy, which some people believe in, is about without the intervention of some political power from above, this can overlap with my argument in terms of the daily practice that emerge, that allowed us to interact with each other without the moral consensus from above. And the only question I have, of course, which one of the reasons why I did not put my argument in the anarchy school, so to speak, is that I believe that one of the like the question that has not been answered sufficiently in a very kind of imagination or in a very frameworks of anarchy is that to deal with that's kind of like the daily practices of moral agreement, and whether there's some practices that we use to deal with the moral disagreement on the everyday level can be utilized to be used in the global politics and can become in a way the reflections or inspirations in terms of that how we're going to deal with the conflict between states or between different regions. That seemed to be the part of the question that the School of Anarchy would miss out, because I think not all of them, but the majority of them won't be dealing with about the very question that how we're going to still solve the conflict between different states. Because anarchist school would think we saw that, you know, either we won't have states, nation states anymore, or that either this is not like the regime of the space of the political question or the debate that we're going to draw upon. So I think that's in a way my argument or my thought is that we cannot ignore the existence of the current interstate system, and which I believe that the daily practices, the inspirations or the very idea of dissensus can be still applied to solve the interstate conflict nowadays. Thank you. I don't know why that's like sufficiently answer your question, but
yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, I did have largely the same question that was just asked, but then I think I'll maybe clarify a few points just in terminology here. Is when we're talking about anarchism in this sense, it seems like the anarchism that is feared is a kind of barbarism or a kind of return to feudalism, or maybe that's still its own kind of order. And I was curious that this idea of a decensus and the idea of sort of traveling in the 17th century or whatever you had there was reminds me of the philosophical concept of the nomad or nomadism, where there is never an established space. It's always liminal for the purposes of just facilitating everyday life. And we can't really imagine that now, even though it could potentially already be occurring just outside of our context. Like, I wouldn't know what it's like to be homeless, for example, but they make their own communities. Just food for thought. Thank you.
Yeah. That's a really good point, because the literature on nomadism is exactly the one that which I've been reading, but I did not have enough space to put into the paper here or the presentation here, because in the discussion with the nomads, and also that in the Chinese context, there's also discussion related to the concept liu ming, which is about, in a way, this kind of, you may say, social system that is different from the Confucian political social system that's always characterized the traditional Chinese social life. And I believe to a certain extent that's the very kind of like the nomad being is what I picture here as the kind of like the actors within this kind of ethics of disorder. And the question, of course, that which I have with the nomadism is that whether this is the new form of subjectivity, so to speak, that has been created in recent times, or whether this reflects some kind of a long-term or long-establishing practices that has been used in the past. So this is why I did not fully integrate the literature on nomad here. But this is exactly the part which I've been thinking about, is that how we can interact with some of the historical perspective on nomadism or on the very concept of liu ming, and whether some of the practices or some of the literature which they point out there can be in a way being described about the ethic of disorder here. Yeah, thank you for that.
We have two more questions from Georg and then Mario Wenning. First, Georg, you can go first.
Thank you, Professor Liu, for the presentation. As you mentioned at the beginning, I already kind of listened to the presentation once before, and I sympathize very much with your points. I feel like very close somehow to the points you're making. I'd just like two things. I mean, you said you're going to Europe in May, right? To conferences and trying to kind of tell people there that that this kind of disagreement on certain whatever political and ethical issues is something that cannot be easily overcome, and it shouldn't necessarily be overcome. Good luck with that. I wonder what the reaction will be, because it seems to me that the still very dominant moral discourse in Europe is very much geared towards consensus. I mean, that's a central notion you find in Habermas, right? The idea that moral communication and rational communication is basically geared, that's the purpose, to achieve some form of consensus. And that's kind of a very much like a common assumption. You also saw it in the conference we had in Beijing, which is where we met, right? Where it also the point was to achieve this consensus, this kind of, however minimalistic it is, and how far we can, how much thin we can make it, doesn't matter. The whole purpose, even if we have to compromise and make everything very thin, the idea is that we have to achieve some sort of consensus, and that somehow more morality and the very engagement in morality is supposed to find that consensus. So there's a very strong understanding, also different version, Kant, who's very important, right? That we can somehow identify the moral law that everyone has to agree on, and which has as a very essential aspect to it being a law, that it doesn't allow exceptions, right? And in a way, still, I think this tradition in Western moral philosophy is very much, you try to, which of course never actually happens, but it is geared towards identifying that which achieves that consensus. So I think specifically for a Western audience that does moral philosophy or does morality in any way, no matter what they say, I think they still kind of very much identify the engagement in moral reflections as geared towards identifying that which somehow everyone has to agree on. Your kind of approach questions that, but you still want to call it a moral approach or an ethical approach. But I would say in some very essential way, it's an amoral approach, because it gives up the very notion of the desirability or even achievability of consensus. So that's why I wonder why you still want to insist somehow on calling your project ultimately an ethical project or a moral project. And in relation to this, you identify somehow, as do the moral philosophers, and there again, I would maybe recommend you to be even more radical, because I think it's actually a consequence of what you're saying, that there is a kind of parallel between morality and order. But if we actually look at morality, and again, you can also point to Taoism, but we don't have to do that. Morality is often very much associated with disorder. But when we look at order, we find order in nature, we find order in society, especially at the places. You mentioned that at the beginning, I found that interesting. The conflict zones, which on the one hand are very much chaotic places, but which still allow
Georg, can you hear me? No. There is a poor connection at this time.
Yeah. I thought it's a problem from my side. I was just checking my
now it's fine.
Yeah.
Now it's fine. So shall we just maybe move with a question by Mario Venning and then allow Georg to be back, so that you can, because I don't think he managed before the interruption to complete his point, right? So better we wait for him to be back. Mario, you're there, right? Hi, Mario. Yes, you ask your question now.
Hello. I think Georg is also back right now. So I wonder whether Georg would like to.
Georg,
finish
now
his
you
question.
seem to be back, right?
Sorry,
You want
yeah,
to go-
I lost
yeah.
the connection. I don't know
Yeah.
where I was cut off. So
I think
maybe
you were.
maybe we just move on. I'm sorry. I just lost the connection. Sorry.
But you may want to just like finish formulating the question for Professor Lu.
I don't remember where I was cut off. I was saying a lot, maybe too much. So I don't know when I was cut off. I don't know what I said. The first question was, maybe I've summarized it in one point. The first question was, because you give up the search for consensus, you might want to rethink if you still want to call this a moral quest, and maybe it's better to replace it with something else. And the second question I had in relation to this, why associate order with why associate morality with order rather than with disorder? It seems to me, you gave at the beginning this interesting example when you go to a war zone and you expect everything to be completely chaotic, but in fact there are also spaces of order emerging. And I would guess these are specifically precisely the places that are not dominated by morality. They're dominated by something else, whatever, economic activity or other forms of social order emerging in the amoral space. So I would think empirically, morality is actually more correlates more with spaces of disorder than with spaces of order, and the absence of morality corresponds often more with order than with disorder. So the idea that more morality leads to more order, I think, is counterfactual. Less morality correlates more with order.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Yeah. About like, because I believe that you before you were cut off, you mentioned about why did not go like one step further and become more radical, and why I'm still using the very concept of ethics, for example, or call this an ethical approach. I admit that I did not find a better term for that, because when I'm trying to describe, I can describe it empirically about how people manage to live together in radical moral disagreements, for example, in conflict zones and all that. But it's difficult for me to come out with a specific term, except for ethics of disorder, to describe that what might be the reason why they be able to live together is about their personal capacity, it's about their emotions, maybe there's kind of sentiment. But there's no right now I have not found a satisfactory explanation or like a terminology for that to describe that. And I believe the second point which you point out is even more interesting, is that whether we can have political orders without norms or without morals. And in some cases, we seem to see that there might be more orders with less norms or with less morals. Yeah. And I think that I believe that in a lot of authoritarian regimes, you would say that this is exactly the logic of the politics here, is that by giving out more moralities, in a way that what you have in return is more orders, this kind of logic of exchanges. And I think to a certain extent it is true. On the other hand, whether this kind of logic of exchange can operate forever, because in kind of some cases we suddenly realize this kind of chain broke down. Even with less moralities, you even have disorder or less orders. Upon a certain point, this kind of logic of transaction does not work anymore. So what caused that? So I think that bring out like a different layers of the issue here. But this is also the very part of the political philosophy that I'm kind of interested in. So thank you for pointing that out. I will give a little bit more thought on that.
Thank you.
And I believe finally we have the question from Professor Wenny.
Mario.
Yes, thank you very much for the wonderful talk, Professor Lu Xiaoyu. So I enjoyed it very much and feel very sympathies also with this ethics of nomadism and Liu-Ming literature. I also enjoyed the style of your presentation in not using a PowerPoint. I find it much easier to follow the argument. So the question I have for the worry I have is whether there's a danger to throw out the baby with the bathwater, for lack of a better term. So whenever you mentioned the desire for peaceful coexistence, I was asking myself whether one could not somehow replace this with some notion of order. Naturally, the concept of order sounds very problematic, and we usually think of it in terms of top-down order. You made the argument that even Walser's proposal of a minimalist order is somehow problematic and represents the urge for creating somehow an order. And I fully agree that it may be problematic to somehow fix a notion of consensus, and this may create more disorder. But at the same time, isn't it the case that many people, especially people who are in conflictual situations like the one in Syria that you describe, express somehow also this urge for order, that it's not just the invention of Walser or Habermas, but that it's actually somehow rooted in our life world. It may be expressed in various ways as a learning for peaceful coexistence, as a yearning for basic goods like security, clean water, food, and access to education. And as you mentioned, what we see in this situation is often that people get together, for example, in Syrian refugee camps, and very quickly they organize the basics for peaceful coexistence, water, food, safety, even access to education in these camps. But for this to work, somehow they also need to protect these refugee camps in these zones. Or if we use the other model that you introduced, the recent conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or between the rising order of China and the established order of the Western countries, isn't there somehow a need for spaces of neutrality, perhaps one could call these, in which somehow the common search for peaceful coexistence could somehow articulate itself, and somehow partners that are in war enter a situation of dialogue. And for this, you represented, for example, Habermas as somehow an order theoretician interested in consensus. But from early on, he emphasized that, well, the search for consensus somehow is the precondition of entering into dialogue. But as soon as we enter into dialogue, naturally, we will have a rise in different opinions and the plurality of perspectives. But the important thing is that we are in dialogue and somehow find ways of taking on other perspectives and seeing our perspective from other positions. And for this, what seems to be needed is some space for neutrality, or in the case of war, some notion of transitional justice, where conflict partners can at least agree on what allows them to have something like peaceful coexistence. And so I'm wondering how your notion, I think it's a very good notion for nomadic existence, for forms of risk aversity, maybe in complex situations. But how can it help us in actually addressing situations where conflict is already happening? So this would be my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Vanni. And the question that which you pointed out is exactly what had been troubling me in my kind of argument and also in my discussion. And I think that if we go back to the conflict zone example, which you rightly pointed out, that the urge for orders in all kind of situations of adversity have been very important for individuals and for small groups and community to get back to the life or to continue their way of living. And like what's like my kind of inquiry or my kind of investigation look exactly like the urge for order at the individual level or at the small scale level, and the urge for order probably at the political philosophy or even at a more abstract and at the state level. When the urge for order being translated into the state actions or into the realm of global politics, they seem to be very detached from those kind of daily practices of how people getting organized together and restore their lives, so to speak, their possibilities of life. At the state level or at the global politics level, when we're trying to restore the order or when trying to establish that order, there will be kind of a more controversials or more conflict arising from that what kind of order, whose order is going to be the dominant one in that kind of space. So I think that here that you have the first level of the issues about like how do you scale up this kind of urge for order. I did not problematize the urge for order at a very individual level. I think it's a very natural response. And I can see that how the urge for order can operate in the very small scale communities or in a refugee camp in some cases. But once it's been scaled up to a much larger state and global level, and here this is where I see where the problems comes in. It's not about the reflecting the possibilities of peaceful existence anymore, but rather it's more about, I will not point it so extreme terms, but it's really more about, you know, dominance and control and the very question of power. So I think here is the first question is about how to scale up the different layers of the urge for order. And the second question, or like the other, like the follow-up question, which you pointed out there, is that in terms of the peaceful coexistence or in terms of the normative dissensus, which I pointed out there, is that what might be the solutions in a way that what might be the hopes of the politics in face of the challenges that we are trying to deal with today. And whether this kind of normative dissensus can provide inspiration for that. And I think that one of the key issues which I'm trying to address and which I think can be applied to the current realities is that in our education or in our kind of a conflict resolution, we always trying to kind of to set off like institutions or a set of norms or like the rules that can be the basis from which we build on, you know, like a fully functional society or political regime. And I think that on the educational level, exactly there's something else that we can try upon, is that instead of teaching that you have a shared identity with someone else, like we're all going through nowadays, you know, you have a shared identity, you're all part of this kind of a larger political community, and you're a citizen. This is what defines who you are politically in this political community. So you have this kind of shared values or shared identity as the very start for you to enable you to live together, and this explains why you're living together to a certain extent. But I think that's my proposal, or what I see that what can be done differently is exactly to teach that you're radically different from the others. And there is a possibility even that you don't have anything to share with each other. But nonetheless, this does not prevent you, this difference does not prevent you from living peacefully with the other. I think this is where that's the additional gap that we can fill in, is that to acknowledge the radical differences while saying that after that acknowledgement, you will still need to learn how to live with each other peacefully. I think this is the part of the practices, or this is part of the kind of thing that which we're trying to, there are already things being existing there. So this kind of model can exist. But the question is that this kind of model do not have their voice in the building of the political orders, or being sidelined or being neglected, being giving away to the very practices of building at a political or normative consensus. So this is what I'm trying to say here, is that we have to expose, we have to, in a way that let that kind of practices speak out. Not necessarily becoming the mainstream, but to become this kind of like a new spaces of possible co-living that can lead us to deal with conflict, either in our society or in elsewhere.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank you.
very much. And I think our time is up now, but that was such an amazing time with you, Professor Lu. And maybe you may want to share the details of the meeting that you that you're going to have also in 1 month from now, right? Maybe that will be
Yeah.
another occasion, to stay on, on this
Yeah.
topic also for us. Yes. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. It was great to have you with us today. And so have a nice evening. You're in Beijing, right? So we are sharing the same time now.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.